Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Leslie Bebko, your host from Pharmaceutical Online and Life Science Connect. Joining me today, I have John Thompson, Head of Digital Product CAI, and Stephen Farrell. She is the Chief Product Officer at Valkit.ai. Over the next 45 minutes, they'll be talking about how AI-enabled digital validation technologies enable the predictive plant. Feel free to submit your questions during their presentation using the Ask Question module on your screen. We'll be holding a live Q&A session a little bit later, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible. Any that we can't get to, we'll follow up on with you after the event. If you run into any issues, please try refreshing your browser first, and if you need additional support, let me know via that same Q&A window. Finally, this event will be available for on-demand viewing. You'll receive a link via email as soon as that's ready. So with all of that said, I'm going to turn it over to John to get us started. John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Leslie. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, Stephen and I are going to talk to you about exploring a topic that's becoming increasingly important across life sciences manufacturing, and that's how validation data can evolve from a static compliance artifact into a strategic digital asset. So traditionally, commissioning and qualification activities produce large volumes of documentation, your IQs, OQs, protocols, reports. But once those documents are approved, much of that knowledge gets effectively locked away in PDFs and document repositories. I like to say, stop locking your critical data in a closet somewhere. So the real value of that data often remains untapped. But with AI-enabled digital validation technologies, or DVTs, we now have the opportunity to capture that lifecycle information in structured, machine-readable formats that allow it to be analyzed, connected, and to use to drive better operational decisions. So today we're going to talk grounded in some industry standards, including the ISPE Baseline Guide for Commissioning and Qualification, one of Stephen's favorites, GAMP5 Second Edition, and some emerging guidances on AI in GXP systems. So our goal is to show how these principles come together and enable something the industry has been pursuing, I think, for years, and that's a predictive plant. So let me walk you through the agenda, and we'll see where we're going to head today. So first, we're going to start by talking about validation data as a strategic asset. So we're going to look at how traditional commissioning and qualification lifecycle defined by the ISPE Baseline Guide that aligns with digital transformation initiatives, and why validation data is such a powerful but underutilized source of operational intelligence. Next, we'll explore second-gen DVTs and how modern platforms combine AI, structured validation records, and system risk assessment methodologies to streamline and enhance validation activities. From there, we'll discuss the transition from reactive to predictive operations. So historically, validation programs have been largely retrospective, focused on documentation and then periodic reviews. But with modern analytics and continuous monitoring, validation data can actually help anticipate risks before they impact your operations. In the fourth section, we'll look at enterprise integration, showing how digital validation ecosystems connect with systems like MES, CMMS, QMS, the alphabet soup of systems that you're already using in your operations, and how they all connect together to support a predictive plant model. And then finally, we'll talk about enabling your organization. So the governance, the processes, the competencies required to successfully implement these AI-enabled validation systems. So together, these topics are going to tell a story, and that's how organizations like yours can move from compliance-driven validation to data-driven operational intelligence. So we start with validation data as a strategic asset. So to understand the opportunity, we first need to rethink how we view validation data. Historically, validation has been treated primarily as a compliance requirement. The focus was on generating documentation that demonstrates systems are installed and operating according to specifications, definition of validation. But if we step back, commissioning and qualification activities actually generate a tremendous amount of knowledge about our systems, processes, equipment, and risk controls. So this includes some of your design decisions, your system risk assessments, critical parameter relationships, performance data, operational insights. All these things are gathered throughout the asset lifecycle. Problem is that in many organizations, this information is stored in static documents, which is difficult to analyze, connect, or reuse. So digital validation technologies change that to a dynamic relationship. So instead of treating validation outputs as isolated documents, they structure the information as data that can be queried, analyzed, and linked across systems and lifecycle stages. So when that happens, validation data becomes something much more valuable than documentation. It becomes lifecycle intelligence. And that intelligence enables organizations to better understand system performance, identify emerging risks earlier, and ultimately make more informed decisions about system suitability, maintenance, and change management. So of course, the reason for transformation is necessary is because traditional validation model has several fundamental challenges. And one of the biggest issues is knowledge fragmentation across the life cycle, the asset management life cycle. So during design, development, commissioning, qualification, there's a tremendous amount of insight that gets generated. Decisions about risks, design rationale, operational limits, but much of that knowledge becomes trapped in those isolated documents and siloed systems. Another challenge is loss of tacit knowledge, or knowledge that's in people's heads about what's happening during those processes. So the reasoning behind decisions, why particular risk control was implemented, or why certain parameters were selected. It's often understood by the project team at the time, but maybe not necessarily captured in that static documentation so that somebody in the future can easily access it. So over time, this leads to fragmented risk assessments, duplicated testing, limited visibility into historical decisions. Digital validation technologies actually address these issues by ensuring that information generated through the life cycle is captured as structured and reusable data. This means design, commissioning, qualification, and validation outputs are connected and then maintained across that life cycle. So instead of knowledge being locked in documents, it becomes accessible, searchable, and reusable, which significantly improves operational efficiency and risk management.
Thanks, John. So just let me pick that thread up and get specific about what that shift looks like in practical terms. So on the left side, we can see where many organizations still live, right? So what often happens, well, you end up with paper IOQs that cover way more scope than the risk profile of the system justifies, commissioning work that gets completely repeated during qualification. Essentially, you're testing the same thing twice. You're spending the time twice, producing the paper twice. Your vendor FAT and SET documentation are sitting on a shelf and are largely disconnected from your qualification. And there's no opportunity in that model for cross-system intelligence, as John said. The right column is where the ISPE baseline C&Q guide lands. And this is not a technology pitch, right? These are capabilities that are described in the guidance itself. Digital records that meet good engineering practice standards, integrated C&Q where vendor documentation is leveraged for qualification rather than duplicated, system risk assessment outputs that scope your testing to critical data elements, and continuous monitoring that replaces the snapshot approach of interval-based periodic review. So here's the thing about these two columns. The gap between them isn't a technology gap, it's a methodology gap. Companies still living in the left column aren't doing it because they lack tools, they're doing it because the process was designed around a document production rather than a knowledge capture. So this is really where the second generation DB2 platforms are built to change for, and that's what we're going to get into as we progress today.
So what does that look like in terms of your digital plant maturity as it relates to validation processes? So in early stages, we might call those level 1 and 2. Validation is still pretty primarily paper-based and fragmented across digital systems if it's captured digitally at all. So Documentation exists, but information is still largely disconnected and data reuse is minimal. Most companies now are moving towards a connected plant level, at least from a digital perspective, maybe not necessarily from a process perspective, as Steve alluded to. But at that level, your organizations are, typically tracking validation data is stored in integrated digital repositories. This will improve the visibility and allow you to move to managing those validation processes more efficiently, but still maybe not connected into the overall asset lifecycle. The real shift happens when you start getting towards level 4 in the predictive plant. At this stage, validation data is no longer just historical documentation. Instead, it becomes a part of your data set that can be analyzed to identify different patterns, predict potential failures, and support proactive decision making rather than retrospective. Level 5 adaptive plant, I think we're still not there yet from a technology perspective, but that's when we intend to start using closed loop intelligence, where validation insights continuously inform your system and your processes so that optimization and operational control can happen in real time. So the key takeaway here is that digital validation maturity directly supports your broader digital plant maturity. And as validation data becomes more structured and connected, it becomes foundational for enabling predictive manufacturing capabilities. So Leslie, you want to ask our poll questions?
Absolutely. So on your screen right now, we do have a poll question, if you wouldn't mind answering for us. Asks, where does your plant fall on the scale of digital plant maturity and validation? And your choices are A, level 1 to 2 digital silos, B, level 3 connected plant, C, level 4 predictive plant, or D, level 5 adaptive plant. So while we give our audience a chance to answer this, John, what do you think? What do you think we're going to hear?
I think most people are probably in the B range. I hope there's not a lot of A's still out there, but we'll see.
All right,
Hopefully
Steve,
some
care
people
to
are
chime
moving
in?
towards C.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, much more measurable than John. I expect everyone to be an A.
All right. Well, just a few more seconds here, and we'll see what they said. All right, here we go. All right. Not exactly what you wanted to hear, but I'll turn it back over to you guys. We have level 1 to 2 digital silos coming in at close to 70%. So back to you, gentlemen.
All right. Thanks for participating in the poll, folks. So before we get into DVT capabilities, I just want to make sure we're all looking at the same map, because this lifecycle diagram really is the backbone of everything else we're going to discuss for the rest of the session. So just starting from the top left, we begin with the URS, user requirement spec. That's where you're defining what the system needs to do in terms of your quality team and what you can work with. From there, you're going to system classification, which is the direct versus non-direct impact determination that, again, is encouraged through the baseline guide. This is really a binary decision that sets your qualification burden. If you get it wrong, you're overqualifying everything or underqualifying things that matter. So super critical. System risk assessment is really the engine of the whole process. This is where you're going to identify your critical quality attributes, trace them to your critical process parameters, and then identify the critical aspects and critical data elements that your system controls or monitors. Your testing scope, your acceptance criteria, your periodic review triggers, they all flow from here. And as we move through design review and design qualification, C&Q planning, testing and documentation, acceptance and release, periodic review. Underneath all of this really runs 3 supporting programs: your vendor assessments, your engineering quality processes, and your change management. I'll come back to nearly every box on this diagram during my sections, but what I really want you to take away from this now is that this isn't a linear checklist. It's a risk-informed decision framework. And the question we're going to answer today is, what does a second generation DVT platform do to make this framework actually executable at scale. So really quickly, we use a lot of acronyms in the life sciences. I've learned even more this year. I didn't think that was possible after 30 years, but we know they can become wallpaper if they're not embedded, and if you're not embedded in this stuff every day. So very quickly, just to give you a little bit of context to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. What you're going to hear most about today is really the top row, the CQA, CPP, CA, CDE stuff. These four terms really form a chain. Critical quality attributes are your product quality attributes. They're coming from R&D and tech transfer. CPPs are your process parameters that affect those CQAs. CAs and CDEs are the system level controls and data elements that your equipment or software is responsible for monitoring or controlling. And then the entire system risk assessment is all about tracing that chain. Everything else on the side, URS, FAT, SAT, MES, QMS, DBT, we'll head them in context as we go, so they should be pretty clear about what we're talking about. But consider this your magic decoder ring for the rest of the session.
Great to have a magic decoder ring. All right, so how might we assess your maturity, and how would that evolve as your commissioning and qualification practices evolve? So in the early adaptation stage, many organizations are going to operate without a clearly defined C&Q plan. System risk assessments may not be consistently performed, design reviews are probably informal, and testing is often duplicated between commissioning and qualification. So the results are inefficient, you get redundant work, you get inconsistent risk management. So as we progress into a more transitional stage, you start to see more structured processes. C&Q plans are defined, system risk assessments are introduced, and vendor documentation begins to be reviewed and actually incorporated into your risk planning processes. But these processes may still operate a little independently rather than as part of a fully integrated life cycle. So when you move into that more mature stage, everything becomes connected. Your risk assessments drive testing scope, vendor FAT and SAT documentation are actually leveraged appropriately, and traceability matrices provide clear visibility into system requirements, risk controls, and verification activities. So DBT platforms play a major role here because they allow these relationships between requirements, risks, and test evidence to be managed digitally rather than manually. And the result is a more efficient risk-based validation lifecycle that gets aligned with these modern regulatory guidances that we're talking about.
Thanks, John. So we've talked about where organizations are and where the guidance points them. So now we're going to talk about platform capability that bridges that gap. So we use the term second generation DBT as a distinction. We're making that distinction deliberately. First generation DBT platforms were initially designed as paper on glass. And while they've evolved at different speeds and have different functionalities today, largely the main focus is to give us somewhere to put and track, PDFs and approved documents. That certainly has improved auditability from paper processes, but for the most part, there hasn't been a shift in terms of actual process. So the distinction being then that second generation changes the process. It doesn't just store validation records, it generates them, scopes them, links them to risk outputs, and uses them as an ongoing analytical asset. And that's a fundamentally different character or category of capability, excuse me. So let me show you what that looks like. So broadly, we're taking 6 capabilities. I'll take them in pairs because they form kind of natural groupings. So across our top row there, content and structure. So AI augmented content creation means your specifications, test scripts, risk assessments are being drafted from contextual AI that understands your system type, your risk profile, and your regulatory obligations. Critically not generic templates, contextual output. Paired with structural digital validation records, this means those outputs are machine readable. They're not just stored PDFs, they're queryable, linkable, analytically useful records that meet good engineering practices and good manufacturing practice documentation standards. Scope and visibility, risk-based testing, scaling automates what used to be a manual judgment call. How much testing does a system actually require? Well, having a risk-based testing engine allows testing scope to be driven. You're testing things that have a direct effect on product quality, patient safety, and you can meter the testing based on the impact of specific specifications. Scale and prediction, so the ability to reuse templatization, master data management. The second facility that you stand up doesn't have to start from scratch, right? You have predefined, pre-configured packages, pre-qualified requirements, dramatically reduced deployment time, and predictive risk identification means that you're not waiting for periodic review to find out a system is trending towards requalification event. CDE performance data that can tell you have a problem before it becomes one. So taking together these 6 capabilities broadly describe a platform that doesn't just support your validation process, it really becomes your validation process. When we think then about quality risk management for AI-enabled systems, this is probably an area that I get the most questions in when interacting with folks in the field, because I think a lot of people see AI and QRM together and wonder whether we're introducing new risk frameworks. And to be clear, we're not. The left column is the science-based QRM that's always been applied to direct impact systems, impact on patient safety and product quality, CQA and CPP language, design controls, your CAs and your CDEs, and then your procedural controls to manage risk, system classification, vendor documentation, suitability, etc. Nothing new there. On the right, what we are introducing is what you additionally have to think about when the system in question has an AI component. And these aren't abstract concerns, they're concrete engineering requirements, right? Data fitness for purpose. If it's a CPP monitoring model, was it trained on historical batch data from 2 years ago and hasn't been validated against current process conditions? That's a QRM issue. It's not a technology concern. It's a data integrity concern. Model stability, right? Small changes in your CDE input should not produce disproportionate output changes. You test this the same way as you test equipment. Across the edge cases, your system risk assessment identifies as high risk operating conditions. Human oversight and explainability. This is one that comes up all the time. And I think it's something that the FDA is very focused on in terms of encouraging that. Most of us will not build AI. Most of us will buy AI. And it's really important to understand the nuances of the different technologies that are available to us, particularly in the DVT space. So that ability to have human oversight and explainability is really non-negotiable, right? Your operators have to be able to interpret, challenge, and override AI's input, certainly in the classical sort of DVT use case. Within the GAP AI guide, these are referred to as QRM controls. Finally, just having a governance and revalidation strategy, one that organizations obviously miss. You really need to define up front what triggers a revalidation event when a model drifts. That definition belongs in your C&Q plan. If you don't have it, you have a potential of an uncontrolled change management gap. So I mentioned this earlier, the system risk assessment is really probably the single most important part of the C&Q process, at least from my perspective, hopefully yours. Not your IQ, not your OQ, it's really the SRE. If you get this right, everything downstream becomes easier and more defensible. If you get it wrong, you're either over-testing or under-testing, and you won't know which until an inspector asks. The flow coming in from the left side of the logic chain, CQAs from R&D and tech transfer, CPPs that affect those CQAs, science-based risk analysis per ICH Q9, design and procedural controls, your CAs and CDEs that ultimately mitigate the identified risks. Table at the bottom there is what the SRE output actually looks like in practice, right? So for each step in your operation sequence, you're asking, how can this step impact a CQA? What controls are in place? What are the CDEs that those controls produce or monitor? And then what does residual risk look like after those controls are applied? It's a little hard to see, at least for me in my old eyes, but right at the bottom of the slide there in the kind of pastel green, we have a quote from the C&Q guide, and I think it's really critical, right? Qualification confirms that CDEs and design risk controls identified through the system risk assessment have all been checked, tested, and found to be installed and operating as specified. That's it, right? Qualification is the verification that your SRE risk controls are in place, not a comprehensive test of everything the system can do. So when your DBT platform is driving SRE outputs into your test script generation automatically, this chain becomes auditable end to end. An inspector can follow the thread from a CQA all the way to a specific test case and understand exactly why that test exists. Mr. Thompson. Oh, no, still me. Sorry. Apologies. Okay, so we've covered what second generation DBT platforms do at the point of qualification. So now we want to get into what happens after the system is released, right? And why that operational phase is where the real value of digital validation starts to compound. So traditional model would be qualify the system, file the records, schedule a periodic review in 3 years, repeat, right? That's very reactive. System tells you something is wrong when it breaks or when the periodic review surfaces a trend that's been brewing for 18 months. What we're going to look at in the next few slides is a continuous intelligence model. That's where your CDE performance data is feeding towards real-time. Change impact analysis is AI assisted, and your periodic review is not a scheduled event, but an ongoing analytical posture. So looking at that in terms of performance monitoring and that kind of predictive foundation. So 4 steps on this slide, right? Collect, analyze, predict, act. Sounds simple. The execution is where organizations typically fall down. It's usually because the first step, collect, is manual and fragmented. So collect means CD performance data, qualification records, deviation histories being ingested continuously, not pulled together by a validation engineer the week before the periodic review. If you can't collect automatically, you can't analyze at the speed or scale that makes the next 3 steps meaningful. So analyze in this context means trend analysis across your C&Q deliverables, CPP and CQE correlation across time, across systems. This is where connected validation data repository really starts earning its keep, because the analysis that would take a team of people weeks to do manually can be largely automated. Predict means failure mode forecasting and requalification trigger identification. Not that this system failed, this system is trending in a direction that, based on the risk classification and CDE thresholds, is likely to require requalification in the next 60 days. That is a fundamentally different operational posture. And finally, ACT means proactive intervention, targeted maintenance, C&Q plan updates triggered by data rather than the calendar. The C&Q guide explicitly describes performance monitoring as the prerequisite for this kind of continuous system suitability determination. We're just operationalizing what the guide already calls for, which ties in perfectly to GAMP 5, Appendix 03 for operationalization. So intelligent change impact analysis. Here, we're talking about change management. It's where a lot of the validated state risk accumulates in practice. Not because organizations don't have change management, most do, but because the impact assessment is usually a judgment call made by whoever is available based on documentation that may or may not be easy to search. What AI-assisted change impact analysis can do is automate the cross-referencing that happens at every step of the workflow. So change request comes in, the platform automatically identifies which CDEs, URS requirements, and C&Q test records are impacted, not through a keyword search, through the linked data model that your SRE and test records already define. Change specification stage, you're defining the change in terms of impacted CAs and CDEs. The platform surfaces the downstream effects across interconnected direct impact systems. That's the kind of cascading risk analysis that in a traditional environment requires a subject matter expert who's been on the project for 2 years. Impact and risk assessment. Your risk assessment templates are pre-populated from existing qualification data. You're updating, not starting from scratch, and every action leaves a full audit trail across the ECM lifecycle. The requalification scope then is coming directly from the CDE impact analysis. You're not making a judgment call about how much retesting is required. The data is telling you that, right? This is a defensible, auditable answer to what is currently often an informed but subjective decision. So QMS integration pillars for AI-enabled systems. So this slide ties together the quality system infrastructure that really has to be in place for a second generation DBT platform to deliver its full value. And we've broken it down into 4 pillars. So process performance monitoring, right? Maintaining your state of control through CDE trend data, model KPIs, and qualification status across all your direct impact systems. This is your live quality dashboard. Problem and incident management, targeted follow-up when something flags, whether that's a data quality issue, a model drift signal, or a CDE threshold being exceeded. All of that then linked to your SRA updates, so the response is risk proportionate. Change management, everything we just talked about on the previous slide, triggered by data, scoped by SRA impact analysis, fully traceable. Management review, and this is one that often gets a little bit underweighted, aggregated C&Q data enabling informed acceptance and release decisions and executive level lifecycle governance. Your VP of quality should be able to look at a dashboard and understand the qualification health of the facility, not have to read through stacks of reports. Together, these 4 pillars are what the GAMP AI guide describes as a closed loop quality system. The validation platform isn't separate from the QMS, it's feeding it, and the QMS decisions are feeding back into the validation posture. That's the integrated model. So with that, I will hand back to my colleague, John, and he will take us through into the enterprise integration section where he's going to show you exactly how these systems connect at the facility level.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve, for walking us through what it means to move from reactive to predictive, but let's expand that out to the enterprise level. So DBTs should not operate in isolation. Their real value comes out when they get integrated with broader digital ecosystems in your facility. So what's that look like? This slide shows us kind of a model of what a digital validation ecosystem should look like in practice. So at the center is the AI-enabled DBT platform, which acts as a central hub for all your validation lifecycle data. So this platform will connect with multiple operational systems across your plant. For example, your MES system, where your batch records and process monitoring data live. That includes critical process parameters that influence your product quality, but were defined during your risk evaluation of the validation stage. Your CMMS system contributes maintenance and calibration information, which is essential for understanding your equipment reliability and system suitability over time. And then your QMS systems provide that deviation and kappa information that can be linked directly to system performance and helps maintain the qualification status of your asset throughout the life cycle. And then finally, these analytics platforms can aggregate and visualize information through dashboards and trend analysis. So when these systems are connected, organizations gain a holistic view of your asset performance across the life cycle. This integration enables predictive insights. For example, you might identify trends in calibration drift, maintenance patterns, or maybe deviation history that might indicate that you have some emerging risks with that process or that piece of equipment. So that rather than reacting to these problems after they occur, you can anticipate issues and intervene earlier. So traditionally, system suitability has been evaluated through your periodic review processes. Like Stephen talked about, typically we do that on like a 3-year life cycle, but these are occurring at defined intervals. And they involve evaluating changes, deviations, maintenance history, regulatory updates, and then, determining whether or not a system has remained in a validated state across that period of time. So the ISB baseline guide describes a tiered approach to that periodic review process where tier A performs an initial assessment of changes, your deviations, your maintenance history. And if concerns arise in your tier A review, you move to tier B, which involves a deeper investigation and a risk evaluation. So finally, if that continues to drive more concern, tier C requires corrective actions and requalification activities if you've discovered significant issues in that tier B. So while this approach is effective, it's inherently retrospective. So it's not predicting anything for the future. It's just looking at past performance. So DVTs enhance this process by introducing the capability to do continuous monitoring capabilities. So instead of waiting for those periodic reviews, systems can continuously analyze performance data, track qualification metrics, and detect trends that might indicate that you have some emerging risks. And AI-driven analytics in particular can even flag systems that are trending towards requalification triggers before those issues occur. And this way, your periodic review actually evolves into a continuous validation intelligence. So how do we actually build the predictive plan? One way to think about it is as a layered digital maturity model. So your foundation is a trusted digital data layer. That includes structured validation records, strong data integrity principles based on Alcoa Plus, risk-based system qualification that is aligned with regulatory guidance. And then once you have that foundational data layer in place, you can move to that connected validation data, where information from commissioning, qualification, vendor documentation, maintenance records, operational data, it all gets integrated across those systems. So once that integrated connected layer exists, you can start applying advanced analytics. So these include analyzing trends in your critical data elements, correlating system performance with quality events, and using predictive models to identify emerging risks. So finally, the top layer on top of all that is your predictive intelligence. So at that stage, you can forecast potential failures, anticipate requalification triggers, and proactively manage change impacts before they affect your operations. So this important point is that predictive capability does not come from AI alone. It comes from a structured, connected data, lifecycle data layer. So DVTs provide the infrastructure that makes that possible. Leslie, you want to introduce our second question?
Absolutely. So second poll question on your screen right now. What is the current state of your validation data? So your 4 choices here, it's locked in 3-ring binders. It's digitized, but we don't really do anything with it. Our data is used in trending and reporting, or our data is fully integrated into the asset lifecycle. So if you would take a moment, just answer that for us, we'd appreciate it. John, speculation again? What do you think?
I'm going to be more pessimistic this time, since from the answers in the first one, I'm going to say it's going to be primarily A and B.
All right.
Mostly A.
Steve?
Yeah, I agree with John.
All right. I'm going to have to say I'm going to go with you guys as well. We'll see what it is. A few more seconds here. All right. What do we have? Oh, we do have a little bit more on the B. So it's looking up. So what is the current state of your validation data? Most people responded it's digitized, but we don't really do anything with it. So, all right. Thank you all for your responses. Back to you, gentlemen.
Yeah,
Steve?
so thanks again. Yeah. Thanks everybody for the poll, and thanks for the info, John. So we walked through the technical architecture of a connected predictive validation ecosystem. So what we're going to do now is kind of put the lens back and talk about what it takes to organizationally actually operate in that environment. The platform can only go as far as the people using it can take it. So the next section broadly covers three things: how AI-specific incidents and CAPAs work differently from traditional deviation management, what building AI literacy actually looks like in practice across the validation. So in terms of AI-specific incident and CAPA management, it follows the same structural logic as your existing CAPA process. The difference is that the incident types are different. And if your deviation procedures weren't written with AI systems in mind, they probably don't cover these categories quite yet. So data drift being one. The underlying data model was trained on is no longer representative of the current operating conditions. It's not a failure as such. It really is an expected life cycle event. The question is whether you've defined triggers in order to actually formulate a response to that. Model drift, sort of broader performance degradation as real world conditions evolve beyond training data. It's related to data drift, but it is a little bit distinct. Model drift can happen even when the data quality is pretty stable. Bias detection, systematic errors affecting specific populations or operating conditions. In a pharmaceutical context, this often surfaces as the model may be performing well on one product family, but not so well on another. Ineffective human-AI interaction. I think this is quite underappreciated. If operators can't interpret the model's output, they can't really understand why it made the recommendation, and then they can't confidently override it when needed. That's really a discrete incident type. And the corrective action is very much an AI implementation, not more training data. On the CAPA side, the structure maps directly to the C&Q process. Corrective actions reference your SRA to evaluate CDE impact, and then root cause analysis links back to your risk assessment. When it comes to risk levels, the preventive actions are using tier A and B periodic review data, and then lessons learned flow into engineering change management and C&Q plan updates. All being well, the platform is closing that loop automatically. CDE performance data is linked to CAPA workflows, so the incident response is informed by the same risk data that scoped the original qualification. So this is very near and dear to my heart, building AI literacy and competency. So I'll give you hopefully as a practical take on this, because I think AI literacy can sound like a training program that belongs in the HR budget rather than in the validation strategy. The GAMP AI guide ties AI literacy directly to C&Q lifecycle roles. And that's the framing I'd encourage you to use internally. Not everyone needs to understand AI, but people in the specific roles need to understand AI at specific levels of depth to perform their C&Q responsibilities effectively. So in the concept phase, ideation and URS development, you don't necessarily need engineers to lead this, but you certainly need people who understand enough to identify meaningful AI use cases and translate them into requirements. So basic literacy is typically sufficient here. As you move into the project phase, SRA, CDE identification, DRDQ testing documentation, this really requires deeper technical understanding. People doing SRA reviews for AI systems need to understand model validation concepts, not build models, but evaluate whether the controls defined for a model are adequate. Then into the operational phase, continuous CDE monitoring, tier ABC periodic review, discrepancy handling, change management. This is ongoing. The people managing the operational state of AI-enabled systems need to understand what model drift looks like, how to interpret performance dashboards, when to escalate, and also understand the underlying architecture of the AI that you're using. Not all AI systems are built the same. Educate yourself on the difference between a chatbot and a RAG framework. These are really important distinctions, and they'll help you when you're framing AI from a risk perspective. Four-step program we have here is defining a common language, assessing the current state, aligning with strategy, continual improvement, really a practical implementation sequence, right? We want to start with terminology alignment. You can't have a meaningful conversation about AI risk in your organization if half the room means machine learning models when they say AI and the other half means robotic process automation. What I've seen across the different folks I interact with as people are building these programs out is that the organizations that do it well really treat it as a competency management initiative, not as a one-time training event. It shows up in skills matrices and C&Q, plan role definitions, and onboarding for validation engineers.
All right, so what are a few of the key takeaways we want you to keep with you from today's discussion? First, validation data is a strategic asset. So when you capture and structure it properly, that information generated during your commissioning and qualification actually becomes a pretty powerful source of lifecycle intelligence. Second thing would be your system risk assessment drives the entire validation lifecycle. So by identifying your critical quality attributes, CPPs, CDEs, your organizations can focus on verification activities on the controls that actually matter the most. Third thing would be that periodic review is evolving into a continuous intelligence. So with digital platforms and analytics, you can actually monitor system performance in real time rather than relying solely on interval-based systems. And finally, your organizational maturity is essential for enabling a predictive plan. So technology alone isn't enough. You need to align governance processes, vendor management, and documentation practices with modern digital approaches. So when these elements come together, your validation evolves from compliance function into a strategic enabler of your predictive manufacturing operations. So in close, I'd like to ask you the question, is your organization ready to build a predictive plan? So for many companies, this journey is beginning, and it begins with an understanding of your current level of digital maturity. So that includes evaluating how your validation data is captured, how systems are integrated, how your lifecycle information is used to support that decision making. So at CAI, we work with organizations across the life sciences industry to assess digital maturity and develop practical roadmaps for implementing these modern validation approaches. So together with our partners like Valkit.ai, we're helping organizations transition from that traditional document-centric validation to a more AI-enabled digital validation ecosystem. So if this topic resonates with you, we invite you to connect with us to schedule a digital maturity assessment or talk to us about how we can help you develop a roadmap towards a predictive plant capability. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to your discussion and questions.
All right, John, Steve, great presentation. Thank you so much. We do have some audience questions in. If you guys wouldn't mind answering a few for us, we'll get to as many as we can. As I said before, if you haven't had a chance to submit your question, please do so now. We will get to as many as we can. Any that we can't, we'll follow up with you afterwards. So onto the Q&A. John, the first one's for you. What are the core knowledge management challenges in validation today, and how does a DVT platform address them?
There's a few core challenges. So, tacit knowledge we talked about, you can lose that across the life cycle. That's knowledge that's basically stuck in people's heads. So it needs to get out of there and into a platform or a document. Your validation insights get trapped in silos, and the change rationale becomes invisible to future teams, and fragmented risk assessments in the early stages are another challenge. But a DVT platform can help address that by capturing a lot of that design, development, commissioning, qualification, validation data in a structured and reusable format. So it's accessible. It's not on a piece of paper, locked in a 3-ring binder in a storage area somewhere. It's actually recallable and reusable.
Great, thank you so much. Steve, going to jump over to you. Walk us through the ISPE C&Q process flow. What are the key stages and what supporting programs underpin it?
Yeah, so this goes back to something we talked about pretty early in the presentation, right? So the C&Q process begins with the URS, right? And then that's followed by the system classification, which ultimately, determines that direct, non-direct impact. Once you have that, then you're moving on to the system risk assessment that's linking to the CQAs and the CPPs, which follows into the critical aspects and the CDEs. That's why I told you needed the magical decoder, right, for all these amazing acronyms. That informs your design review, your design qualification, and then from there, your C&Q planning, which ultimately is then setting the strategy and the scope, for your testing and documentation. As you follow it through, you can take that through acceptance and release, getting your quality unit approving it, periodic review, and then all of that's underpinned by those essential elements we talked about earlier, right? The vendor assessments, the engineering quality processes, change management, and then, of course, sort of good documentation practices. But the baseline guide, I'm very biased and very involved with ISPE, but all of the guidance documents are extremely useful in terms of just giving you that foundation to build effective C&Q programs on.
All right, thanks, Steve. John, I'm going to jump back to you. How does the AI-enabled DVT platform function as a central hub, and what enterprise systems does it connect to?
Okay, I think I saw a related question to this of why we would choose to use DVT as the centralized hub. And I guess the additional part of the answer to that is it doesn't have to be. It can be. There are plenty of systems that are capable of taking all that data and pulling it together in a way that can be used by the higher level predictive analytics technologies like AI. But the slide that I showed was to illustrate that your DVT platform can be used as a centralized hub for that knowledge repository. But the key to that is whatever you use as that central repository needs to connect to all the other applicable systems in the life cycle. So it would integrate with your CMMS so that you have your maintenance and calibration records, integrate to your MES if you have one for batch record and CPP monitoring. And the QMS is pretty important as well, so that you have access to discrepancies and kappa management. But then all of those individual data systems that capture different pieces of your overall asset lifecycle need to be combined in a way that the analytics capabilities can then deliver your dashboards, your trend data, and help you understand predictively where your asset is heading versus its expectations.
Thanks, John. Steve, you know what? We'll jump back over to you, and then if you could, John, take a look at the Q&A module in there. Let me know what else we can ask. So, Steve, how does a layered predictive plant architecture transform traditional periodic review, and what are the 4 layers?
Good question. So we hit on this a couple of times through our discussion, right? So a traditional periodic review is very interval based and reactive, right? We're always looking backwards. The concept of the predictive plant replaces this with continuous analysis, right? And again, it's across those like 4 layers, right? So there's the kind of trusted digital foundation, which John just alluded to there in the answer to his last question, with the baked-in data integrity concepts driven by the risk assessment. You've got the connected validation data, which is the cross-system integration across all those different types of systems that you can hopefully, hook in and centralize through the DVT. You've got the AI-driven analytics then, right? So bringing all of that together, doing performance trending, risk modeling on it, discrepancy management, and then taking all of that data and the final step being that predictive intelligence, based on these trends, based on changes we've previously made, things we've previously seen, can we start to forecast failure and get out ahead of it before it becomes a problem?
All right, thanks, Steve. Another one for you here. What should be considered in terms of model maintenance or validation of AI models and how often?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it, I'm going to use a really consulting answer, right? It depends. I think one, have you built it yourself, right? Have you built an AI model for a specific use case within your organization? If you have, I would look at the guidance from the FDA. They have some really good stuff in there in terms of how to frame it up and how to tell your story. So I think that's a great place to start. I think there's a lot of great stuff in the ISP AI guide as well. I suspect, though, that most folks are going to be buyers of AI-enabled tools as opposed to creators. There's a lot of reasons for that, but there's a finite number of people that can actually successfully build useful AI tech, right? Data scientists are in pretty high demand. So the chances are a lot of what you'll do is actually procure those tools. So when you're doing that procurement, in terms of like maintenance and revalidation, the first question you have to ask is, what is the AI doing, right? Is it a human in the loop augment, in which case it's fairly low risk because regardless of what I'm getting from a result perspective, there's always somebody checking it. Is it underpinned with retrieval augmented generation frameworks, right? They can help contextualize and eliminate a lot of the issues we see with, generative AI. What is it actually doing for me, right? And then within that, is AI making any kind of decision on its own, right? Does it have autonomy? Is it making a quality decision? Once you've established those from a kind of a risk prioritization perspective, then you can decide ultimately like what's an appropriate way of qualifying it the first time and then managing it moving forward. But there's tons of nuance in there. But I think the GAMP AI guide is a great place to start, and also the guidance coming out of the agency is fantastic too.
All right, Stephen, John, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. To our audience, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards. On your screen still, if you're ready to understand your current level of digital maturity, want to move towards a predictive future, contact CAI today. Information is there. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day.